Hey, kia ora everybody. I think we're good to go. Just checking in with my colleagues. Yeah, looking good. Awesome. Okay then. Well, welcome everyone to our sixth webinar, Handcuffed by Trade Agreements with Jane Kelsey. My name is Catherine Murupainga Aiken no Ngatikuri in Te Raroa, and on behalf of Pathway to Survival, I'll be one of your co-hosts this evening. And in due fashion, we will kick things off with karakia, and then we'll get into it. Tukua te wairua ki rere ki ngā taumata, hei arahi I a tātou mahi. Me tā tātou whai I ngā tikanga a rātou mā, kia mau, kia ita, kia koro ai e ngaro, tūturu whakamaua kia tīna, haumi e hui e, tae ki e. Let us release our spirits so they may ascend to heights of greatest potential to guide us in our work, as well as in the pursuit of our ancestral traditions. Hold fast and preserve these values to ensure they are never lost. Let us secure this intention firmly, commit to it together, and so it is. So now I'd like to hand over to my colleague Carrie before we introduce Jane. Carrie's got a few housekeeping, I won't call them rules, guidelines maybe, for us all. And yeah, then we'll get into the hui proper. Kia ora, Carrie.
Carrie, you're on mute.
That's clever. Mihi ki te mana whenua o te motu on whose lands and waters we all live and depend. Mihi to all of you who share some part of our pathway to survival kaupapa. Ko tangata tiriti ahau, ko kaori tōku ingoa. We live in a complex, wonderful living world where all species, including us, are connected. For all our failings, we also embody a great deal of care, cooperation, creativity, and dedication. I treasure this and want it to continue. However, we're making huge changes to the climate and to the biosphere. What we do this decade will have consequences far beyond our lifetimes, for better or worse. I'm part of the Pathway to Survival team because I want Aotearoa to address the climate and biodiversity crises in ways that are just to all. We want to work with others to figure out a shared way forward to orient our economy to respect and care for our environment and for each other, based in Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So we all have a way to live while we give up the societal addictions to combustion engine, extraction and waste. That is, we want deep change in almost everything, system-wide, and we need to be well underway this decade. So we must set our direction, act locally and get our government to enact changes at systemic levels to make it possible. Many of you are working to move some part of this forward. Coming to tonight's topic, one facet of this is how we want our government to represent us beyond our borders. How can our international arrangements enable us to make the changes we need? How can they constrain the worst polluters and extractors? How can we cooperate internationally? What are the key impediments we need to overcome and how? In a moment, I'll hand back to Catherine to introduce Professor Emeritus Jane Kelsey. First, housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. You're welcome to use the chat, introduce yourselves if you want to. We'll have time for Q&A. If you have a question for Jane, please put it in chat with a Q in front of it so we can find it easily. And after a while, after we've done that, we will end the formal part of the webinar and stop recording, and you're welcome to stay on for a bit after that for more informal discussion if you wish. Back to Catherine.
Kia ora, Carrie. So it's my privilege and honour to introduce our manuhiri, Jane Kelsey. So as a recently retired Professor of Law at Auckland University, Jane is a hugely admired and respected both locally and internationally as an intellectual powerhouse, I would say, a long-time activist and widely published academic. Jane is known for her incisive and compelling critical analysis of an extensive range of subjects, including colonisation, capitalism, neoliberalism, globalisation, and their destructive impacts. Her staunch advocacy of Te Tiriti o Waitangi and for social justice, democracy, and economic sovereignty for all New Zealanders has raised the consciousness of our nation in fundamental and extraordinary ways. So it's my pleasure to hand the floor now to you, Jane. Take it away. Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou, ki ngā mana whenua o tēnei wā, Ngāti Manihiri, tēnā koutou, e ngā iwi o ngā hoi whā, me te Pathway to Survival whānau, tēnā koutou katoa. It's really nice to have a Zoom where we can be activists again, because it has felt for a long time that we've been stuck for the last couple of years in this zone where you didn't know when you were going to be able to come out from it to do things, at least to do things on the social justice and tiriti front. So I'm delighted to see some familiar names down the list there, and some unfamiliar names, because it's always good to make new contacts. And I'm really grateful to the whānau at Pathway to Survival for being understanding of me being all over the place in terms of times, because things have kind of started kicking off again in the global trade and investment zone that I'm going to talk about. And one of the things that happened during the COVID era, not pretending that it's over, but during the lockdown periods, was that a lot of things were happening invisibly. And it was really hard when you weren't able to be around to get a feel for what was happening, or to be able to spill the beans on things that weren't being talked about. At the same time, it was really good not to be traveling a lot, and not just good for the body and the mind, but also good in terms of carbon footprints. And part of what those of us who are activists in this sphere are trying to do is to work out how best we handle the activism, especially those of us who are kind of intermediaries between what is happening in the secret sphere and what's happening on the ground, how we're going to manage that in a better way than we might have with less thought in the past. And that's going to become especially relevant. So it's something I'll talk about shortly. Let me start with a 101 about what is happening in the space of trade and investment agreements in the context of the climate crisis. And for those of you who know something about it, forgive me if it's too basic. What I suggested I would do, though, was speak at a reasonably high level, and then and make a couple of suggestions about things as well that I think might be useful strategies. And then we can have a reasonably lengthy Q&A. It's much better than me just rabbiting on, and I can't see you, so I can't see whether you're bored or whether you're excited or whether you've gone to make a cup of tea. So I want to talk about two kind of separate dimensions that are happening now that you might want to think about how to focus on, because they have real implications for here. And the first is probably the easier one to grasp the enormity of. For the last 30 to 40 years, but in particular since the early to mid 90s, there has been a strategy that has been promoted by big foreign investors to get internationally binding agreements that they can enforce directly against governments, that guarantee protections for their investments against things that governments might do that affect the value and profitability of their investments. So these are, in the nice term, called investor protection agreements, but they're basically giving privileged rights and guarantees to foreign investors that they can enforce directly in offshore tribunals, which are notoriously pro-investor. So the kind of rules that we find in these investment agreements, and some of them are standalone investment agreements. New Zealand, Aotearoa, is very lucky in that we don't have many of those. We do have one with Hong Kong. We do have one with Singapore, and we have one with China, but Singapore and Hong Kong and China have all been incorporated now into free trade agreements, into investment chapters in them. So where we now find these for Aotearoa is in the free trade agreements, where there are special investment chapters that contain these promises to foreign investors from the countries that are party to those agreements, that guarantee their investors, firstly, a guarantee against what is called expropriation, that is, taking back their investment, terminating their investment, cancelling their investment. So that's considered to be an expropriation. For example, if the government was to take back into state control oil fields or other heavily polluting investment activities, or indirect expropriation, which is if the government regulates or takes other measures that are tantamount to an expropriation. That is, they seriously reduce the value and profitability of the investment. For example, a ban on fracking in a mining activity which is largely dependent on fracking, or cancellation of water rights, or declaring whole areas of dockland no-go mining areas where they had an expectation that their mining license would enable them to do that. So that's one set of the guaranteed protections they have. The second one is a much more amorphous guarantee of what is ironically called fair and equitable treatment, which is basically an empty box into which arbitrators put almost anything. But it is often described as what the legitimate expectation is of a foreign investor, given what governments have said, what practices have been in the past, and so on. Yeah. And so if you've got someone who has started to come and do, say, and I'm using mining examples here because they're kind of the easiest, but who have started setting up the preliminary processes for what they would be looking at in doing then some exploration before they would then seek a extraction license. They would be talking about what their legitimate expectations were. And there are very few protections in there that relate to public policy, environment, treaty, entitlements. When they're in the free trade agreements, the kind of exceptions that they are ones that we find in the World Trade Organization as well. And when those have been relied on, they have been successful to date in 2 out of 49 of the disputes that they've been relied on. So they're kind of defenses once you've been shown to be in breach, that you have to then raise these defenses. Now, what's worse is that these claims are made under these agreements to either ad hoc tribunals that are set up specifically to look at them, or to a tribunal process set up under the World Bank. And the claims are usually secret, so they're not published unless both parties, the investor and the state being sued, agree. And the hearings are not in public, although there are in a handful of places what we call amicus curiae briefs of those who are interested parties, but very, very narrow space in which they're allowed to do that, and they have to get permission from the tribunal to do that. But the tribunal is made up of these arbitrators who are notorious for conflicts of interest. So the arbitrators are commonly also lawyers that act for foreign investors in one dispute, and then act as judges in another dispute, don't have to declare conflicts of interest, are renowned for their pro-investor interpretations of these very opaque terms, don't have to follow a precedent of what was decided in previous cases. And so there will be one arbitrator appointed by the investor, one arbitrator appointed by the state, and a chair that the two of them agree on. And these secretive hearings in these ad hoc or World Bank tribunals are to look at a breach of those specific guarantees, and if they find a breach, to award compensation. And the compensation is not simply what the investor, like the mining company, has invested. It is for that plus their future profits that they have foregone into the projected lifespan of the project that now can't go ahead, and compound interest on those, and in some cases punitive damages against the state if the state is seen to have been acting especially improperly. And so these we call investor-state dispute tribunals, or the system is known as investor-state dispute settlement, or ISDS, has become hugely controversial because the more foreign investors have become aware of them and the more agreements there have been with them especially agreements of the US, but not just the US, Canada, the EU, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, China. You can see the potential for ambulance chasing by lawyers in these big, expensive law firms who get mega bucks for bringing these cases, who encourage the bringing of cases. And yes, it is something that has been a problem for a long time. It has just expanded. And now what we've got is third-party funders who fund an investor to bring a case, so the investor doesn't actually have to outlay any money, and the third-party funder gets a cut of the award at the end. And so this has become a kind of investment in itself. And so it's not surprising, as environment issues have become more significant in, say, the last 20 years, that the vast bulk of the disputes that we've been seeing are disputes that involve environment and natural resources. And more recently, as we've had governments adopting climate policies, we have seen a growth in the number of those. So a study that was done in 2021 identified at least 13 climate-related ISDS disputes between 2012 and 2021. Right? Now, part of the, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples of them, but part of the importance of this is not just what happens in the disputes. It's what we call the chilling effect, that the potential for a dispute will deter a government from taking certain action. Now, you might remember back with the plain packaging tobacco, Philip Morris and co. were threatening to bring these kinds of disputes and they brought one against Australia and against Uruguay, and that led our government to hold off doing anything here for some time. And in fact, Australia only won that dispute because of a jurisdictional issue. That is, Philip Morris reincorporated itself in Hong Kong so it could bring the dispute. And it lost it because of that, not because its rights weren't being taken away. And so you can imagine the kind of arguments that they will use here. And one of the things I'll explain again later, but I want to raise it here, is that increasingly in new free trade agreements, they are introducing, again, ironically described chapters called transparency. But the transparency is for the foreign states and their investors. If the government is proposing to introduce a new policy or law, it needs to publish that in advance and seek comments and take account of those comments before it finalizes a decision to proceed. Now, we already have that to some extent in the so-called best practice regulatory guidelines that were introduced in the neoliberal regime about a decade ago. But this cements it in permanently. And so it's a lobbyist's charter to be able to bring threats and to build up an evidence base if they bring a dispute about having raised these issues and having had these issues ignored. So what are some examples of the kind of climate-related disputes we've seen? Well, this paper I referred to identified 3 different categories. One of them was claims for compensation following the introduction of what might be described as climate-justified policy measures that leave investment assets so-called stranded. So if you think of a coal-fired power station, yeah? And so you have a new government commitment, not only not to have any new ones, but to phase out existing ones. Then those who have them may well seek to bring a dispute, not in our domestic courts. They're not under our domestic law about property rights, but under the tribunal and the investment agreement. Now, they have to be an investor of an agreement that has that in it. And so who we have those agreements with becomes important. What's the nationality of the investor? But investors are very clever at reincorporating themselves in various different countries that have these agreements. So the first one is these kind of climate justified policy measures. A second one is the rollback or amendment of policies and legislation that was introduced to meet climate goals. So for example, subsidies that have been introduced on renewables, or other incentives to encourage investment in green technologies or other climate mitigation strategies. If the government then terminates those kind of support systems, so they become a kind of guaranteed income flow for those entities. A bit like we have with the toll roads and the tolls that they get guaranteed there. And so that's a second example. And most of the cases that we have in that category do involve subsidies or other incentives. That includes things like wind farms or research into wave technology and so on. And the third category is environmental permitting. So approvals, licenses that are withheld or cancelled or revoked on environmental grounds. One of the ones you may well have heard of was the Keystone XL pipeline in the US, which when that was initially cancelled, Keystone XL put in a claim under the investment chapter of the North America Free Trade Agreement. It was a Canadian investor bringing a dispute against the US, claiming $15 billion as damages for that. And then, of course, Trump put it back on and Biden has turned it off again. And so it's been reinstated. So that kind of shows you how big the stakes are here. Another one, the Italian Parliament in 2015 reintroduced a moratorium on oil and gas projects within 12 miles of the coast, but did so midway through a permitting process for the development of an oil field. And again, kind of familiar sounding claimed there is 200 to 300 million. There is an energy company in the Netherlands, for example, whose plant had to close because of new legislation. It has claimed 1.4 billion euros. And so what you've got here is a really big incentive for the investors to utilize whatever tools are available. The biggest one, which thankfully New Zealand is not a part of, is something called the Energy Charter Treaty, which is specifically about energy projects and was initiated at the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union, and it has investor-state dispute settlement in it. But because of a whole series of these disputes recently, a number of countries, especially EU member states, have been withdrawing from it. And so we're seeing withdrawal from those. We've also seen withdrawal from a number of the bilateral investment treaties, the ones that are specifically about investment. We've seen withdrawals of some countries from the World Bank's arbitration body. And so there's been this huge backlash. And one of the things I've been working on over the last few years is the attempt by some states that have big investors to reform the system to try to stem this exodus and the backlash against investor-state dispute settlement. Now, New Zealand, as I said, has now no operative direct investment agreements, but we do have investor-state dispute settlement in a number of our our free trade agreements. We have it with China. We have it with Hong Kong. We have it with South Korea. We have it with the ASEAN states, which includes Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, Brunei. We don't have it in the Australia agreement. Because this was one of the big issues in TPPA, because it would have given US investors the rights to sue New Zealand. That was one of the key campaigning tools we had in the TPPA. And it was one of the things that the then Labour government opposed. It's one of the grounds it opposed the TPPA. As did New Zealand First, as did the Greens. And in fact, New Zealand First introduced a private members bill in the name of Fletcher Tabuto that would have stopped future governments from signing up to investor-state dispute settlements in future agreements. That never got to fruition. But in the coalition negotiations between New Zealand First and Labour, it was agreed that Labour would not sign up to ISDS in any future agreements. And so we don't see it in the recent UK free trade agreement, and we don't see it in the recent EU free trade agreement, and we don't see it in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is a ASEAN, etc. one. But they operate alongside those existing agreements that still have it in it. When they signed up to the successor to the TPPA, you might remember the US withdrew from the TPPA. And then Labour and New Zealand First justified signing up to its successor by saying, oh, what we're signing up to isn't as bad. And one of the things they said wasn't as bad was that they got side letters signed by a number of countries saying they wouldn't use ISDS but between themselves and New Zealand. Now, the problem with that was it didn't override the existing agreements. So, for example, Malaysia agreed to that, but it didn't stop the Malaysia agreement happening. Chile agreed to that, didn't stop. I've forgotten now the list of the countries. Anyway, we have some side agreements, but it doesn't cover, and this information, if you want to get the correct details on it, is still on the itsourfuture.org website. But Canada, Japan, for example, still have ISDS with New Zealand, alongside those under the CPTPP, alongside some of those others. This is one of the issues that we raised in the Waitangi Tribunal claim on the TPPA, that if on the basis of the Crown's treaty obligations, it was going to, for example, stop deep sea mining offshore, the Treaty of Waitangi exception in the TPPA only applies to giving more favourable treatment to Māori, which is kind of positive discrimination. It doesn't apply to that kind of situation. Right? It also says it's self-judging for the New Zealand government to decide if it's a treaty issue, but it only exempts it from state-state disputes and not investor-state disputes. And so one of the issues that we'd raised in the tribunal, which didn't ever get to a hearing because we had to narrow down the issues that were going to be addressed, was the risks that there are for Māori in an investment dispute. And the risk that this would have a chilling effect on the government adopting treaty-based policies. So, a campaign tool. At present, no investor-state dispute settlement is just a policy. It is not a law. To get governments to commit to legislating not to have investor-state dispute settlement in future agreements, and to seek to withdraw them from the agreements they have now, is a very good campaigning tool. And there are many, many, many examples internationally that you can draw on in the context of the climate crisis to show why that is essential for it to retain the capacity to be able to, one, meet its Treaty of Waitangi obligations, and two, to be able to meet its obligations in terms of the Paris Agreement or whatever measures we're using. Okay, so that's the easy example, right? Investor-state dispute settlement. The trade agreements, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on these, are a bit more complex, but if we just start from the mindset of a free trade agreement, it's a Western conceptual framework that views the world in terms of commodities, property rights, and markets, which means that the model of trade it adopts is based on abstracted markets and facilitating exchanges of commodities across borders based on the theory of comparative advantage, which is that all countries shouldn't try to do everything. Countries should specialize in what they do best. For example, New Zealand grows very good cows that have high productivity of dairy. Other countries have very effective steel producing. Other countries still might have a very good car industry, or semiconductor chips, or running servers for digital space. And so the function of these agreements is to reduce barriers to the free flow of those things that countries do best to other countries that aren't as optimal in doing it. Now, that has several important consequences for the climate crisis. One is that the environmental and climate dimensions of production are not factored in. So, for example, New Zealand's methane emissions are not a relevant consideration when it comes to New Zealand seeking more access for New Zealand's dairy products into other countries. That means we would seek to produce more, because that's just not part of the picture. The second is, of course, especially when you're dealing with commodities, but even if you're dealing with servers for digital space, you have very high sunk energy costs. So you've got your carbon footprints in terms of your commodity movements, but also in terms of the very high energy consumption of servers or even e-vehicles and so on. And of course, you've got the mining issues that are related to the batteries and so on. And so the trade agreements have expanded in recent times, and when I say recent, since early 1990s, it's recent for me because I'm old, to include services and to reduce barriers to services, including, for example, big hotels and so on, but also to facilitate the big airline operations and cruise ships and so on. And we know that the tourism industry is also a high carbon footprint industry. And so countries that have become increasingly dependent, if you think of the poor Pacific Islands countries who are so tourism dependent, but also bearing the brunt of the climate crisis, you've got a real contradiction there. There are exceptions in these agreements, but the exceptions, as I said, are kind of defenses after you've been shown to breach the rules, and they're limited to what is the least burdensome approach for commercial interests to meet your objectives. There are a range of other rules that block technology transfers to poorer countries. There's what I mentioned about the transparency provisions, about the rights to lobby by the foreign investors in their states and so on. Now, of course, it's become more difficult for countries to continue running this model. And so what we've got now is, with the obvious impact of the climate crisis in terms of trade, supply chains, disasters, food crises, and so on, and big arguments about food stock holding in countries that, or even putting export restrictions so they make sure that they've got food security. All of those have become big issues in the trade arena. So now we have sustainability. Everything's about sustainability as well as about inclusiveness. Inclusiveness being gender and labour and small and medium enterprises and sometimes Indigenous peoples and all of this lovely blancmange of, alongside sustainability. But all of these things are chapters on top of the old template. So the old trade template continues, and then you've got all of these clip-ons. And the clip-ons are often about cooperation on these issues, or affirming our obligations that we've adopted in the Paris Agreement, or committing to have dialogue with Indigenous peoples and recognising that they may have something to contribute, or in the recent UK agreement, using all these terms like kaitiakitanga and Māori and popping them into provisions that are the antithesis of it. And so we have that in these agreements. I'm almost at the end of my bit. And New Zealand policy is donkey deep in this because New Zealand has systematically favoured market mechanisms for dealing with the climate crisis. And that goes back in particular in the trade agreements to when Tim Grosser was both the Minister of Trade and the Minister for Climate Change. And so in the climate talks, he was promoting this idea of tradable carbon credits across borders, where you could buy these shonky imagined fraudulent set-offs against New Zealand's increased carbon production. And so that's still the case, and they're still pushing market models in ways that ensure that they don't have to do anything about the production of them, especially in agriculture. So what we're seeing at present is a number of initiatives. One is MFAT is currently developing a new trade and sustainability framework to deal with environment, climate change, and labour. And that has come out of the so-called Trade for All report that was set up by the Trade Minister in the last Labour government, and which they've not done anything about, and now they're kind of doing something, but and it's not all bad, but they're diluting it as they go. The second thing that they have been doing is at the WTO, they have been supporters of an environmental goods agreement that's all about removing tariffs, as if making it easier and cheaper to send environmental goods across borders is going to make a huge difference to the climate crisis. Similarly, environmental services agreements, making it easier for New Zealanders, New Zealand engineers and so on to sell their environmental services into other countries. Now we've got trade and environmental sustainability structured discussion, of which New Zealand is a co-sponsor, about how to make the global trading system protect the environment. We've got an agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability that involves these big players of Norway, Costa Rica, Fiji, New Zealand and Iceland, which is also about liberalizing, taking, a kind of a market approach to goods and services, but with binding rules to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. They're party to a Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform group. But the doozy, and the one that I really want you to think about in terms of a campaign strategy, is that there is a new US-led negotiation which is totally US driven. US has decided to have this. It has set the agenda. It is run out of the US Trade Representative and Department of Commerce offices. It has 4 pillars, one of which is trade, which will include all of the things I've just talked about, but not ISDS, but all of those market mechanisms. A second pillar, which is also based on those market mechanisms, which is called the green economy. A third one about supply chains, so how to make resilient and interconnected supply chains to make the global trading system work better. And a fourth one that's about tax and corruption, but not about debt. And so the first round of negotiations is in Brisbane next week, and I will be over there as a stakeholder, seeking to see what the heck is happening. It is being conducted in secret, like the TPPA, with similar secrecy pact that New Zealand has signed with the US, that none of the documents in the negotiations will be made publicly available until 5 years after the agreement enters into force. It is very likely, because of the time frame and because of statements we've seen from the US business lobby, to be taking provisions out from the TPPA and out from the new US-Mexico-Canada agreement and using those as the negotiating texts. So you can imagine what the US will be and the US industry will be looking at. But if we work off the basis of the USMCA and the TPPA text, we can get a pretty good idea of what's likely to be on the table. There will be campaigns by trade campaign groups who work on climate issues across a range of the countries, which include the US and Australia and Japan and South Korea and India and Indonesia and Malaysia and the Philippines. So there is a potential for building a really strong climate lobby on that. And there will also be here a very strong push in terms of Te Tiriti and Māori, because an entity that was established out of the TPPA Waitangi Tribunal claim, known as Ngā Toki Whakareriranga, sees its role as being outreach to communities affected by these agreements, which include those involved with Te Taio, and obviously within that, those involved in the fight against climate change. And there will be briefings and wānanga and outreach and hopefully collaboration in the development of resources. And this again is where those of us who have kind of the technical stuff can work with those who are working in the climate space to have some influence. And so part of what the goal is for the climate activists to have a voice and to put pressure on the government, because there is Ngā Toki Whakareriranga will do some of that in public, but, and this is kind of awkward, the technical advisors, or the pukenga of whom I'm one, have a confidentiality obligation in seeing text and being able to make comment on text. But the more analysis and material there is from outside, the more pressure can also come in the inside track on what is put on the table in the negotiations. And one of the things Ngā Toki Whakarururanga has been very strong about is that Māori need to have a seat at the table. Rangatiratanga is about a seat at the table. And so there will be ongoing treaty audits of what is happening in this process, which is again part of what Ngā Toki Whakarururanga does against the 4 articles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And so there'll be information on that on the website, which will be launched at the end of next week, which is www.ngatoki.nz. So that's kind of, I spoke for longer than I had intended to, but over to you.
Wow, kia ora, Jane. Where to begin?
Catherine, you're mute.
Sorry, I'm just wanting to say thank you so much, Jane, for that. I'm crushed, really, to hear that since years ago when we were campaigning, things have gotten much, much worse. But, you know, part of me isn't really shocked to hear that. It just seems like the way things are these days, with on so many different fronts. And my hand is hot from writing notes, but my heart is really heavy hearing what you're saying. I've got quite a few, but I really want to get to our audience's questions, but I will just, you know, make this reflection, which is as environmental and social justice defenders on the ground in our respective countries around the globe, it just seems so difficult for us to know the face of our enemy. They're not here. It's not like we can rock up to, you know, a building and know that, you know, the enemy resides inside the building. They're in, like you say, it's everything's so abstracted and we're locked out from knowing about it, which is ironic because it's like, I just made a comment here that I should push enter and send it to everybody. The irony is on the investor side, I imagine the investors are sharing information with all their people, and yet we're stopped. Civil society is stopped. The ones who hold the fundamental sovereign mandate of our nations are stopped from sharing information about these things with wider civil society. Yeah, it's just beyond insane. So, but I just want to thank you for laying that out for us, giving us some things to think about in terms of activism, where to's from here, and showing us where to join the climate crisis activism with the economic side of it, because it's something that does have to change. Like trade agreements are located in the sphere, the bigger macro sphere of economics, broadly speaking, which has to be transformed. And Pathway to Survival just had, you know, a webinar recently with Gareth about transforming economics, and so many people are talking about it, but how to join all the dots together and to make it like, you know, give people permission to join these conversations and not have to have a PhD in this stuff or whatever, because it can be very off-putting to people. So thanks again for everyone for coming. Now I want to hand it over to Carrie, who's going to moderate some of the questions there in our chat. If you've got questions that have just come up for you people, keep putting them in the chat and we'll systematically work our way through them. Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you very much, Jane. It is as I suspected, that these agreements being negotiated out of most people's view are potentially a very big hindrance to some of the changes that we need to make here. So which is exactly why I thought it would be very good to hear from you. So thank you very much. And it's a lot. They've put a lot in there. It's fantastic. I'll pick out some questions from the chat here to read to you, if that's okay. The first one I'll read out as one there from Lindsay saying, airport ownership is currently a hot topic in New Zealand. Hamburg Airport is deliberately majority 51% publicly owned and 49% retirement fund, which has been a decisive factor in helping the airport pursue climate strategies. Please tell us what your take is on the vulnerability of New Zealand airports to private ownership in this regard.
There are rules in these agreements that restrict, if the government was to sell shares, that restrict its ability to discriminate in favour of New Zealand buyers. Right? So that's a general kind of rule. But then there are reservations to those for things that New Zealand currently has in state ownership, or in some cases that it might seek to put into state ownership in the future. There are predominantly the former kind, which is a kind of saving of if the government wants to keep or wants to impose restrictions, if it was to privatize some of its shareholding, or in terms of Air New Zealand, for example, the golden share that they have in Air New Zealand, if they wanted to privatize some of its shareholding but keep the golden share, that is largely kind of protected. But what could be an issue with the 49% retirement fund is if the government wanted to impose restrictions on what the Canadian, I think it's a Canadian Teachers Pension Fund or something, what they could do in selling their shareholding, and that significantly reduced the value of the shareholding, then Canada has investor state dispute settlement provisions under the CPTPP that the Canadian Pension Fund could look to rely on. Likewise, I suppose if the government tried to impose climate obligations on those who bought the shareholding from the Canada Teachers Pension Fund, that significantly reduced the value of the shares, then you could be looking at investment dispute. A lot of that stuff depends on the fine print and on the nature of how the policy is put forward. But if it was put forward as a kind of a government policy or law, then you would expect the transparency rules and the threats to come in as well.
Great, thank you. Looks like we had a temporary glitch with the chat, but hopefully everybody can enter their questions into chat if they have them at this point.
I have put in there a number of links for you to various of the things that I referred to, and including the MFAT site and one of the pro ones, so that you can see how they say nice things to about New Zealand and its climate and trade policies.
Getting into the looking through the chat here. So here's a question from Catherine. Where's the intersectionality with human rights, which all these states have signed up to and which impacts affected populations, including both states and corporates, who have internationally recognised business and human rights standards?
Yeah, so one of the cosmetic changes we've seen in recent agreements is corporate social responsibility being included in the texts, but usually made voluntary, and not even sometimes referring to the OECD standards, for example. But there is in the UN an attempt to develop a human rights instrument that would bind investors, foreign investors, to higher levels of human rights obligations, based not just on the laws of the country they're investing in, but also their home state, and being able to be prosecuted in their home state for breaches of those human rights obligations. That has been drawn out a lot. We've been trying to get some references to that. We've also been trying to get references to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. You can imagine that New Zealand isn't the more powerful party in most of these negotiations, except in the one that it did with Australia and the Pacific Island countries, where it was shameful in its behavior. So yeah, there is no counterbalance. There's no counterbalance. If you have a really badly behaved company for an investor that can show that its investor rights have been affected under those rules, and it goes to investor state dispute settlement, the fact it's been a badly behaved investor is irrelevant. So there is no countersuit that operates in there, because there are no enforceable rights against the investors. So the attempts to introduce these corporate social responsibility things, or even there was one that was introduced in the CPTPP, which was investors must comply with certain kinds of health and environment standards, basically to the extent that this rule, this chapter requires them to. So it was a circular, meaningless piece that people looked at and thought, oh, okay, health and environment, yeah, they're protected. Meh. There are also environment chapters, as I mentioned, in some of these agreements. One of the things the US may seek to do in this new agreement that I mentioned, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF. In fact, it's the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. But because it's a Democrat Party initiative, they are talking about having binding obligations to various multilateral environmental agreements. But I don't think that's going to extend to anything beyond reaffirming their commitments in Paris when it comes to climate. When they did the TPPA, we got a leak of the environment chapter, and this was up on WikiLeaks. I think it'll be up on that bilaterals.org link that someone's put in the chat as well. And I did an analysis of the leak, and what was clear there was that the US was refusing to accept even the inclusion of the word climate change in the environment chapter, and so it's referred to as a low emissions economy. And that was under the Obama administration, not under the Trump administration. So this is why I've been saying this IPEF one is really important, and I think is going to be a really good basis for people getting into the nonsense about investor rights and no obligations.
Seems funny for me to be reading Catherine's questions. So Catherine, if you want to. So one here in the chat is, has New Zealand and other countries who have these cozy differential relationships with corporation, what does that mean in terms of fascism, fascist states? Is it in that direction?
I'm not quite sure. I quite understand that. Can you rephrase it for me?
Thanks, Carrie. Maybe I'll just come in here. I was just, the definition of fascism is something around, that really tight twinned relationship between governments and corporations. They're in bed together. I'm just wondering, are we there? Have we been there for some time? Is there a line in the sand? Is it too late? Have we gone past the threshold? Where are we now?
Oh, well,
would it even make a difference? But it scares the hell out of me.
I mean, the industrial state complex is a long-standing, especially in more powerful states. No, I mean, we have to always remember that these things are not linear. They're heavily contested and they can be rolled back. Now, I gave you the examples around investor-state dispute settlement, and the crisis of legitimacy that surrounded that makes it very difficult to include it in new agreements, except with some developing countries where, for example, China in its Belt and Road Initiative, where it's making lots of investment in infrastructure, including coal-fired power stations and so on. They will include this kind of arbitration in the contracts with developing countries. And so, you can see how the power imbalances in that will operate. But we're seeing it also emerging in the clean energy space as well, especially after the Ukraine war. Because you've got the need to develop energy self-sufficiency, both on green energy, but also on traditional bad energy because of the security risks to energy, especially in the EU, but also in other countries that have been dependent on supplies from Russia. And so that makes it really important to keep mapping not to have a static think about what's happening. But there's also added complexities that come in. Some are even now talking about, okay, we need to go back to nuclear energy. And so how do you deal with the additional factor of nuclear energy in there? And there's an exemption for the nuclear stuff under the security exceptions in the free trade agreements. And so at the same time, the fact that they have been in these various negotiations, including sustainability and references to climate and so on, means that they know they're vulnerable. They know that a social license to continue negotiating these agreements is under threat. And so our job is to make it more so.
Thank you. Another question. If the government were to step in and nationalise Z and petrol diesel ATK fuel distribution systems, so they can introduce, for instance, sinking lid rationing to progressively reduce emissions, what would the investor-state dispute system exposure be like?
It will depend on where the New Zealand investors are often they'll have very complex corporate structures. So if one of their corporate entities that they can claim is one of their parents is in a country with which New Zealand has an agreement that has investment chapter and investor state dispute settlement, then they will be trying to use that. And they will be trying to use it as a threat, and the government will be very well aware of it. And you will know that when there is a proposal, the government gets a regulatory impact assessment done, and it will get input from a range of government ministries. And MFAT will be one of them. And usually the advice that comes from MFAT will be redacted, so you will not see it. So you will not have an ability to challenge it or to expose it, which is one of the really deep frustrations in this space. If they try too hard, though, and I go back to the Australian Philip Morris plain packaging, they opportunistically relocated their parent company to Hong Kong because Australia had an investment agreement with Hong Kong, and they failed because it was just too blatant.
Sorry, I had a question from you. The two issues that you suggested as bases for campaigns, is there someone or some group already leading on those, and how do we join in? That's from Linda.
Right, so on the IPEF, this new US-led negotiation, there are a number of groups across those participating countries who are part of a loose network called IPEF Allies. I can put out on IPEF Allies to find if there are any of them working specifically on climate, because I know that there are some in the US. US groups aren't always the easiest to work with, especially because this is a Democrat government. And some of the environmental groups are not wanting to go too hard on them because of what the alternative might be. But there are certainly those who've been working around Keystone XL pipeline and so on, and there will be, and I'm not sure, I suspect that they are not that well linked into the Indigenous networks, but they may well be. The First Nations networks in the US, but also in Australia, because you've got all of the uranium and other mining issues and the fracking issues and so on in Australia. And I'm sure that in Australia, the climate groups will be active once they know. This thing is new, right? The US announced it about 9 months ago, but no one knew what it means. And then they issued these 4 pillars, which just have a list of issues about 3 months ago. And now we are going to have this first round of negotiations, and hopefully we can get some idea of what the heck is happening, but the US has a very tight timeline, so we're assuming it's going to do a cut and paste from other agreements. And so after this negotiation next week, I think there will be a more formal kind of campaign structure that will be set up. On the other one, investor-state dispute settlement, no, there isn't. There was a really good campaign on investor-state dispute settlement, which included some of the environmental groups like Greenpeace, and so Russell Norman is very familiar with the ISDS issues. Mike Smith is very familiar with them in terms of the iwi chairs. And so, you know, just to look at, that's not an IPEF issue though. That's a kind of election space policy issue, and putting questions to the different parties of whether they would. So we don't even know if National would now oppose ISDS, whether, because it's so unpopular here, whether it would continue Labor's policy. But there is a risk with that, because that was the situation in Australia some years ago. Labor had a policy of no ISDS. Then the Liberals came in and said, oh, we'll look at it on a case-by-case basis. And then the newly elected Labor government is now saying no ISDS, but it's just policy, so it isn't binding. So what we need is something visible, embedded, let's not call it entrenched. Yes, constitutional transformation is the way to transcend all this, but part of our problem has been, on the one hand, whilst that's what Ngā Toki Whakarururanga it stands for, we also have to make sure that the door is not slammed shut by these international agreements that are bloody hard to get out of. It's easier to stop new ones, but incredibly hard to get out of them. It's been easier with some of the investment agreements, but really, really difficult to exit from existing ones.
Oops, I just lost it again. Question here from Lindsay. Does the ETS fall under these agreements? For instance, is there a possibility an overseas investor in carbon forests can claim damages under the agreement, as you've described?
There are kind of two elements to that. One is that the ETS carbon credits are themselves considered to be an investment, because they are a property right that has value. And so were there to be something very significantly done to affect the value of those carbon rights or ETS property rights, and again, if the holders come from one of those, such as Chinese forestry owner or Indonesian forestry owners or Malaysian forestry owners, or even those who have bought ETS on a secondary market, yes, there would be issues there. Secondly, if there are forest owners that claim that changes to the rules relating to the carbon credits they get for the forests, that is potentially an investment issue, right? Because it is devaluing their investment in the forests. And if you just have to look at who owns the bulk of the forests, and those are countries people from countries, corporates from countries that we do have ISDS with.
I think we've come to the end of most of the questions that were in the chat there. So I think this might be a good time to wind up the formal recorded component of the webinar. And thank you very much for both speaking and answering all those questions. I suspect there might be more discussion to be had if anyone wants to stick around now after we karakia and stop the recording, but that's optional extras. So I will remind.
Please excuse me from because I need to go and cook myself some tea.
Fair enough. Remind people to have a look at our website, pathwaytonewzealand.nz. We've also got a Facebook page and the YouTube. The past recorded webinars will be on, you can find them on our website there if you want to see the previous ones, and this one will go up in the next few days. So with that, can I
add one additional thing, which is if you're going to quote any particular countries that I referred to here, please do check back up on the It's Our Future website, because I was working from memory and I don't want, the last thing I really hate inaccuracies, and so please do kind of just check that up. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I will hand back to Catherine to close us out with karakia.
Kia ora, yes, and I'd just like to thank you, Jane, and also everyone who's joined. It's a pretty intense topic for this time of the evening too. We've been working all day or been doing whatever mahi we've been doing, and this on top of that. So I'm just going to say I'm impressed with you all. Thank you very much for your effort. It's really appreciated. So we'll just close our this part off with the karakia, and then we'll move into some informal discussion for those nerdy types like myself who will be hanging about and having a bit of a ongoing yarn. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia ki te uru tapunui. Kia wātea, kia māma te ngākau, te tinana, te wairoa i te ara takata. Koia rā e rongo, whakairi ake ki runga. Kia tina, haumie, huie, tae ki e. Let us call upon, draw upon all that is most sacred to clear and free our hearts, our bodies, and our spirits. Our path, there is the atua of peace suspended on high above. Let us come together and affirm this intention. And so it is. Kia ora, thanks again. Thanks, Jane. Have a great dinner. And we'll see you on the other side.